A young boy lost in the wilds of Wyoming, and a herd of wild Mustangs that do something no one could have expected. As the sun dipped low over the vast emptiness of the Wind River Valley, 7-year-old Joshua Blackwood sat crying on the edge of a dusty, forgotten road. He was alone, scared, and completely lost. He had wandered too far from his grandmother's ranch chasing a rabbit, and now dusk was setting in fast. The sky was turning gold, the wind carried nothing but silence, and there was no sign of help in sight. That's when it happened. From beyond a nearby hill, a sound began to rise, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves striking earth. Out of the golden haze emerged a herd of wild Mustangs, their coats glowing in the fading light, their movements smooth and powerful. And leading them, a striking black stallion with a brilliant white star on his forehead. Joshua froze. His small body trembled as the wild horses began to circle around him. These weren't farm animals. These were untamed, unpredictable creatures of the open range. Anyone watching would have assumed the worst. But what happened next defied every instinct, every assumption, every rule we think we know about the natural world. Instead of attacking, the horses formed a ring around the boy, a silent, living shield. The black stallion stepped forward, lowering his head until his velvety muzzle gently touched Joshua's shoulder. The boy flinched, but the touch was soft, reassuring. The stallion wasn't threatening him, he was protecting him. A gray mare joined, sniffing the air near the child and swishing her tail calmly. Slowly, Joshua's sobs faded, his breathing steadied. He stared into the eyes of the horses and in a whisper asked the only question that mattered. Do you know where my grandma is? Of course, they couldn't speak. But the black stallion looked toward the direction they had come from, then back at Joshua, as if telling him, "Follow me." And then, without a word, the herd began to move. Some in front of the boy, some behind, the stallion right beside him. They weren't leaving him behind. They were guiding him. What started as a terrifying moment became something else entirely, the beginning of a story no one in the community would ever forget. When a reclusive Vietnam veteran happened to witness this unbelievable event from a nearby ridge, it triggered a series of events that would expose hidden secrets, bring feuding neighbors together, and unlock a bond between child and beast deeper than anyone could imagine. And just when you think the story can't get any stranger, a local biker gang known more for their rough reputations than their kindness gets involved. Why? Because even they have a code, and some things are worth protecting. This story isn't just about one lost boy or a wild herd of horses. It's about loyalty, instinct, and a kind of silent understanding between species that no scientist could ever explain. It's about finding connection in the most unexpected places. And it's a story that will leave even the toughest wildlife rangers questioning everything they thought they knew. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this touched your heart, hit subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something even more powerful waiting for you. Their calm presence gave Joshua a strange sense of comfort. For the first time since he got lost, he felt safe. With a deep breath, he wiped away the last of his tears and slowly rose to his feet. "Are you taking me home?" he asked softly, reaching out to touch the stallion's strong shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact, the black stallion let out a sharp, piercing whinny that echoed through the valley. A moment later, an unexpected sound answered in the distance, not from another horse, but from an engine. Headlights appeared on the horizon, slowly cresting the hill. Thomas Redwater was on his way back to his remote cabin after a rare supply run into town when he noticed something strange on the road. Squinting through the dusty windshield of his old pickup, he frowned. "What in the world?" he muttered. At first he thought he was imagining things. A circle of wild Mustangs standing around. A child. Thomas, 72 years old and toughened by decades under the Wyoming sun, narrowed his eyes. His weathered hands tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed the truck. A Vietnam veteran who'd seen more than most could imagine, yet nothing like this. As the truck crept closer, the headlights lit up the surreal scene, a small boy in the center of a quiet, unmoving circle of wild horses. At the front stood a large black stallion with a white star on his forehead. Recognition struck Thomas like a thunderclap. "Star," he whispered, a name he hadn't said in years. It couldn't be, but it was. Strangely, the herd didn't scatter like wild horses usually do when a vehicle approaches. They simply shifted, just enough to let the light fall on the boy's face. Thomas stopped the truck and stepped out, careful not to startle the animals. "Hey there," he called gently, his voice steady but warm. "You all right, son?" Joshua looked up, eyes wide with relief at the sight of another human. "I got lost," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't find my grandma's ranch." Thomas took a slow step forward. "You're a long way from any ranch I know. What's your name, kid?" "J. Joshua, Joshua Blackwood." Thomas froze. The name sparked something in him. "Blackwood? Margaret Blackwood's grandson?" Joshua nodded quickly. "You know my grandma?" "I know of her," Thomas replied, memories rushing back. Margaret's ranch bordered the public lands where these Mustangs roamed. She was one of the few who treated them with respect, never driving them off or complaining to the authorities. The stallion, Star, watched Thomas closely. His eyes were focused, intelligent, and familiar. He let out a quiet snort and pawed at the ground before stepping back, giving Thomas room to approach. "These horses," Thomas said, almost to himself, "they've been looking out for you." "The big one, Star, he was really nice to me," Joshua said, eyes still locked on the stallion. "I was scared, but when they came, I felt better." Thomas extended his hand toward the stallion, palm up, an old horseman's gesture of peace. To Joshua's astonishment, Star leaned in, sniffed Thomas's scent, and gently pressed his muzzle to the old man's hand. "He knows you," Joshua said, amazed. Thomas's throat tightened. "Yeah, we've got a bit of history, this one and I." He turned to Joshua and gave a nod. "Let's get you home, son. Your grandma's probably worried sick." Joshua hesitated. "But what about the horses? Will they be okay?" "They'll be fine," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "They've survived out here for generations. They know these lands better than any man ever will." As if to prove it, the Mustangs shifted again, parting like a curtain to reveal a clear path to Thomas's truck. He held out his hand, and Joshua took it without hesitation. "Can the horses come with us?" the boy asked as he climbed into the passenger seat. Thomas smiled. "They'll follow in their own way." And they did. As the truck rolled forward, Star and the herd began to move, keeping pace along the roadside, never falling too far behind. Joshua pressed his face to the window, eyes wide. "They're following us," he whispered. Thomas nodded slowly, still processing what he was seeing. "Yes, they are. And that's not normal, son. Not normal at all." "Why would they do that?" Joshua asked, unable to look away from the horses running alongside them. Thomas gave an honest answer, his voice low. "I wish I knew. In all my years with horses, I've never seen wild Mustangs act like this." As they neared the Blackwood Ranch, one question burned in his mind. What was the connection between this boy and that stallion? It defied logic. It defied experience. But it was real, and it was just the beginning. "Were you out there long before the horses found you?" Thomas asked gently, his eyes still flicking to the rearview mirror where the herd had vanished behind them. Joshua thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "I'm not sure," he said. "The sun was still high when I got lost. I was looking for my jackrabbit friend. He lives near the big rock, but I went too far." Thomas glanced sideways. "And the horses, what exactly did they do when they saw you?" Despite everything he'd been through, Joshua's face lit up. "They came over the hill, a whole bunch of them. The big black one saw me first. I thought they'd run me over, but they didn't. They made a circle around me like they were keeping me safe." Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Star had always been a protector, fierce, loyal, but that was with his herd. This was something entirely different. "Have you ever seen them before today?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. Joshua nodded quickly. "Sometimes they come near Grandma's fence. The black one, Star, He watches me when I play. Grandma says I shouldn't get close, but they don't scare me. A chill ran through Thomas. They've been watching him for weeks, maybe months. But why? Just then, the lights of the Blackwood Ranch came into view. Flashlights bobbing across the property, vehicles parked in clusters, searchers still calling out in the dark. And at the gate, a familiar figure. "There's my grandma!" Joshua cried out, pressing his hands to the window. Margaret Blackwood stood illuminated by the glow of headlights, her posture tense, eyes scanning the road. Thomas slowed the truck and glanced back one last time. On the ridge behind them, the silhouettes of the Mustangs were still visible. Starr stood at the center, watching. "Joshua," Thomas said softly just before the truck rolled to a stop. "Those horses did something tonight I've never seen before, not in all my years working with Mustangs." The boy looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "They're my friends." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, I believe they are. And that's what makes this truly extraordinary." If you're still with us, thank you for being here. Stories like this take time to find, to tell, and to share. If it touched you, subscribe to our channel, because tomorrow we've got another story that just might change how you see the world. Margaret dropped to her knees the moment she saw her grandson, wrapping him tightly in her arms. Her hands trembled as she stroked his hair, tears sliding down cheeks carved by years of sun and hardship. "Thank God," she whispered, voice breaking. "When you didn't come back for dinner, Her words caught in her throat, the fear still too raw to finish. "I'm okay, Grandma," Joshua said, hugging her back with all the strength his little body could muster. "The horses took care of me." She pulled back slightly, confusion crossing her face. "Horses? What horses, sweetheart?" Before he could answer, Sheriff James Holden stepped forward. Tall, calm, with silver streaks in his hair and eyes that had seen more than most men cared to admit. "Mrs. Blackwood, we should get him checked out just in case. Dr. Mitchell's here." Margaret looked up, and for the first time really noticed the man who had brought her grandson home. Her eyes widened. "Thomas Redwater," she said, as if speaking the name summoned a ghost. "It's been years." Thomas nodded slightly, clearly uncomfortable under so many eyes. "Found him out on Ridge Road," he said simply. "About 5 miles east." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. We had search teams in that area not even an hour ago." "Well," Thomas said, "he was there. He didn't offer anything else." "Doctor." Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned vet with kind eyes and a calm presence, approached. "Hey there, young man," she said warmly, kneeling beside Joshua. "Mind if I check you over real quick? Make sure you're all right?" Joshua nodded, but his eyes were on Thomas, who was quietly backing toward his truck. "Mr. Thomas," the boy called, "are you leaving? You didn't tell them about Starr?" Thomas froze. All eyes turned to him. "Starr?" the sheriff asked, suddenly alert. Joshua nodded, unaware of the weight the name carried. "The black horse with the white star on his head. He protected me. Mr. Thomas knows him." The crowd fell silent. Thomas looked like he wanted to vanish. Margaret, sensing his discomfort, gently placed her hand on Joshua's shoulder. "Let's get you inside, sweetheart. Dr. Mitchell needs to check you over. Then you can tell us all about these horses." As the crowd began to drift apart, questions hung in the air. Quiet, heavy, unspoken. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary rescue, and those weren't ordinary horses. Sheriff Holden stepped toward Thomas, his expression unreadable. "You planning to stick around a little longer, Redwater?" he asked. "I'd like to hear more about how you found the boy." It wasn't a request, and Thomas knew it. He gave a reluctant nod, already sensing that his quiet re-entry into town was about to get more complicated than he ever intended. Inside the warm but modest Blackwood Ranch house, Joshua sat at the kitchen table sipping a glass of milk, a plate of cookies within easy reach. Dr. Mitchell had given him a clean bill of health, a few scrapes, some dehydration, but nothing serious. Margaret stayed close, hovering like a protective shadow, not quite ready to let her grandson out of her sight. The front door creaked open. Sheriff Holden stepped in, followed by Thomas, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Then Joshua spotted him. "Mr. Thomas," he beamed, "did you tell the sheriff about Star? And the other horses?" Thomas shot Margaret an apologetic look as he took a seat at the table. "Not yet, son." Sheriff Holden pulled out a notepad, his tone calm but professional. "Why don't you walk me through what happened, Joshua? Start from the beginning." With the wide-eyed energy only a child could have after such an ordeal, Joshua began recounting everything. How he chased his jackrabbit too far, gotten lost, sat crying by the road. "And then the horses came," he said, arms moving animatedly. "A whole bunch of them. The big black one with the star stood right next to me. They made a circle. I think they were keeping me safe." The adults exchanged quiet glances. Sheriff Holden raised an eyebrow. It was easy to dismiss as the imagination of a scared child, all except Thomas. He sat silently, staring into his coffee, not saying a word. Sheriff Holden finally spoke, keeping his voice measured. "That's quite a tale, son. But wild horses don't typically approach people, let alone surround them like bodyguards." "They did," Joshua insisted. "Tell him, Mr. Thomas. You saw it too." All eyes turned to the old man. Thomas hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. "I found the boy out on Ridge Road, surrounded by the Red Rock Mesa herd. They'd formed a circle around him. The black stallion, the one with the star, stood closest." The sheriff looked up sharply. "You're saying a wild Mustang herd protected a child? That they were guarding him?" Thomas leaned forward, voice steady. "I know how it sounds, but I've worked with horses my whole life. What I saw tonight, that wasn't normal wild behavior, but it happened." The room fell into a thick, quiet tension. "And you say you know this particular stallion?" Holden asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I said the boy called him Star, that's all." But Joshua wasn't ready to let it slide. "No, Mr. Thomas called him Star too. He knows him. He said they have history." Margaret's gaze sharpened as she looked at Thomas. She knew him too well to miss it. There was something he wasn't saying. Sheriff Holden jotted a few notes. "Mr. Redwater, I'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow. Give an official statement." Thomas nodded curtly, already regretting ever stepping out of his cabin. "Sheriff," Margaret interrupted gently, "it's been a long night. Can this wait?" Holden glanced at her, his tone softening. There was history there, too, shared decades in the same town, through the same storms. "Just procedure, Margaret. Nothing to worry about, if everything's as straightforward as it seems." But everyone in the room knew this was anything but straightforward. When the sheriff left, the house fell quiet again. Joshua, oblivious to the tension, happily returned to his cookies. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Joshua, why don't you go get ready for your bath? I need a quick word with Mr. Redwater." "Okay," the boy said with a little pout. "But can Mr. Thomas come back tomorrow? I want to ask him more about the horses." Margaret offered a faint smile. "We'll see, sweetheart. Now off you go." Once the boy disappeared down the hallway, she turned to Thomas, her tone firmer. "All right. What really happened out there?" Thomas sighed, suddenly looking far older than his 72 years. "I told you what I saw. Your grandson was surrounded by a herd of wild Mustangs. They were protecting him. I've never seen anything like it." Margaret studied him carefully. "And the black stallion, the one Joshua called Star, you knew him." Thomas's eyes drifted to the window, where darkness had fully settled over the valley, a long time ago. "Thomas Redwater," she said, her voice low but steady. "I've known you since we were children. You've never been one for talking, but I can tell when you're holding something back." He met her gaze finally. There was no point hiding it now. "The black stallion, I helped him once, years ago. He was just a foal. His mother had been killed during a BLM roundup. He was wounded, left behind." "You saved him," Margaret said softly, piecing it together. Thomas nodded. "Brought him back to my cabin, fed him, nursed him. When he was strong enough, I let him go. Figured I'd never see him again." Margaret leaned back, her face awash in something between wonder and disbelief. "But tonight, he remembered you." "Seems that way." She sat quietly for a moment, then asked the question that had been burning in both their minds. Why would he protect Joshua? Thomas shook his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Wild Mustangs don't form bonds, not like that." "They're not like domestic horses," Margaret said quietly. "Wild Mustangs don't bond with humans. They survive. They avoid people, but they didn't avoid Joshua. They surrounded him, protected him." Thomas had no answer for that. The silence between them stretched out, thick with questions neither of them could yet name. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice even lower than before. "There's something else you should know. This isn't the first time Joshua's mentioned the Mustangs. He talks about them watching him from the ridge above the east pasture. I always thought it was just a child's imagination. But now you're not so sure," Thomas finished for her. She nodded slowly. "He says the black one, Star, comes closest. Sometimes he just stands by the fence watching him play." Thomas's brow furrowed. That wasn't just unusual. It was downright unnatural. Wild stallions didn't loiter near ranches. They didn't observe children, and they certainly didn't voluntarily approach fence lines. "Has Joshua ever tried to feed them? Gone too close?" "I've told him over and over to stay away from the fence when they're near," Margaret replied. "Wild horses are unpredictable, dangerous." "Yet today, they protected him," Thomas said, still trying to make sense of it. Margaret nodded again. "Yes, they did." From upstairs came the sound of water running. Joshua's bath. The moment was broken. "I should go help him," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "He's still too little to manage it on his own." Thomas stood as well, seizing the moment to excuse himself. "I should get going. The sheriff wants me at the station tomorrow." Margaret gave a gentle reminder. "Don't forget." Thomas grimaced. "I'll be there." As he turned toward the door, Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Thomas, for finding him, for bringing him back." The warmth in her voice made Thomas shift uncomfortably. It had been a long time since he'd felt that kind of human connection. He nodded, clumsily, and stepped outside. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the familiar scent of sagebrush and pine. Thomas paused on the porch and glanced toward the hills. There they were, still, dark silhouettes under the moonlight, watching the herd, and at the front stood Star, motionless, powerful, his form clear even in the dark. As Thomas watched, the stallion raised his head, and for a long moment it felt like the horse was staring directly at him. Then Star gave a small toss of his head and turned, disappearing over the ridge with the others behind him. A chill ran down Thomas's spine, not from the cold. Something strange was unfolding in Wind River Valley, and whether he wanted to or not, he was now a part of it. The drive back to his cabin was long and silent, headlights cutting through the dark as questions flooded Thomas's thoughts. Why did the herd protect the boy? Why were they watching him? And what, if anything, was coming next? When he finally pulled up to his old, weather-worn cabin, nestled beneath the trees at the base of a quiet hill, he didn't feel the usual calm of solitude. He felt watched. Inside, he lit a kerosene lamp and settled into the same worn armchair he'd used for decades. The small room was sparse, neat, and quiet. On the rough-hewn table beside him sat the only personal item in sight, an old photograph in a wooden frame. In it, a much younger Thomas stood beside a tall, powerful black horse. Not Star, but another, a military service horse. Both man and animal wore the marks of war, uniforms, discipline, brotherhood. Thomas picked up the frame and ran a calloused finger across its edge. "What do you make of all this, old friend?" he murmured to the quiet room. No answer came, just the faint sound of wind outside. He knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow wouldn't be quiet. Tomorrow meant questions. It meant people. It meant breaking the silence he had spent so long building. And somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the trees, a wild stallion he had once saved was doing something no horse should be doing, forming a bond with a human child. It shattered everything Thomas knew about nature. But he'd seen it, with his own eyes. He set the photograph down, walked to the window, and stared out at the moonlit valley. Tomorrow, he'd go to the sheriff's station. Tomorrow, he'd talk. But tonight, he just stood in the quiet, staring into the dark, wondering what the dawn would bring. The Pinecrest Sheriff's Station was a simple brick building on Main Street, its entrance flanked by wooden benches, usually occupied by old-timers swapping stories. This morning, 3 of them sat quietly as Thomas Redwater approached, his weathered boots echoing against the sidewalk. They stopped talking as he neared, eyes following the reclusive veteran they hadn't seen in years. A ripple of whispers followed him, but Thomas ignored them completely. He had other things on his mind. Thomas Redwater hadn't set foot in town for years, but today was different. He walked into the Pinecrest Sheriff's office, met by a young deputy who looked startled. "Sheriff Holden's expecting you," the deputy said. Thomas nodded silently and stepped into the office, only to find Holden wasn't alone. A polished man in a tailored suit stood inside. "Victor Harrington," the sheriff introduced him. "He's been buying land in the valley. Heard about last night's events." Harrington extended a manicured hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Redwater." "I've heard quite a bit." "Can't imagine why," Thomas replied gruffly. As Harrington left, he paused. "I heard you found the Blackwood boy with a herd of wild Mustangs. Fascinating." Thomas gave nothing away. Sheriff Holden closed the door. "Harrington's planning a resort development. Big one. That herd, scheduled for a BLM roundup next month. Cattle grazing leases are expanding." Thomas stiffened. "Those horses have lived there for generations." "I figured you'd want to know," Holden said. Later, outside the sheriff's office, Thomas ran into Margaret and Joshua, who had just come from breakfast. The boy rushed up, excited. "Mr. Thomas! Did you tell the sheriff about Star?" They chatted briefly before Margaret's expression grew serious. "The bank's threatening foreclosure on the ranch, 3 months behind. Harrington offered to buy us out. I said no." Just then, 3 bikers from the Frontier Outlaws pulled up. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look. They'd been around more ever since Harrington started buying land. She nodded. "He wants everything." At Murphy's Diner, Thomas learned more. The roundup was being pushed early. Harrington's reach was growing, and not everyone liked it. One of the bikers, Jack, approached Thomas. "We've been watching those horses for years. They're special. If Harrington gets his way, they're gone." Later that day, Thomas drove past Red Rock Mesa and saw the herd, Star included, grazing peacefully. When Star noticed Thomas, he trotted straight toward him. It wasn't chance. It was memory, a connection, one Thomas couldn't deny. He drove to the Blackwood Ranch. Joshua was thrilled to see him, but when Thomas arrived, Harrington was already there. "Just discussing the property," he said with that same cold smile. Margaret was firm. He was just leaving. After Harrington left, Margaret told Thomas the ranch had been in her family since 1889. Now, it was on the edge of being taken. "And it's not just about us. I think this is all connected, Joshua. The Mustangs. The timing." That evening, Star and the entire herd showed up again, this time right at the ranch fence. Nearly 50 wild horses standing calmly, watching, showing themselves. It was more than unusual. It was symbolic. "They came to say goodbye," Joshua said solemnly. "They know the men are coming." A few days later, Dr. Mitchell and Sheriff Holden arrived. The doctor brought DNA kits to test for Spanish Mustang lineage. one last legal hope to stop the roundup. But Holden brought a warning. Harrington's moving fast. You're being watched. That's when Joshua said something that changed everything. We don't need to chase them. Star will come if Mr. Thomas calls him. And incredibly, he did. At dawn the next day, Star appeared on the ridge, followed by the entire herd. They approached the fence, calm and trusting. Dr. Mitchell collected DNA from Star and 2 others. It was unprecedented, but just then, helicopters. Early. Unauthorized. The roundup had begun. Star led the herd away toward steep canyon terrain. Joshua, watching from a truck window, whispered, "They're heading to Eagle Ridge, to Mr. Thomas." When the group arrived, the sight stunned them. The entire Mustang herd was streaming into Thomas's old sanctuary, the same place where he'd once saved Star as a foal. Thomas stood at the gate, waiting. He locked it behind them. Harrington and BLM agent Miller arrived moments later, furious, but Thomas had documentation. The sanctuary's status was still valid. The roundup, not authorized. Dr. Mitchell held the DNA evidence. Riley, the journalist, had it all on camera. Sheriff Holden arrived last, delivering the final blow. Harrington's development permits were officially under review. The herd was safe, for now. As Star gently nudged Joshua's hand at the fence, Thomas finally accepted what the boy had known all along. These weren't ordinary horses, and this wasn't just a fight for land. It was a battle for heritage, freedom, and something even deeper. Joshua looked up at Thomas. "You're going to help them, right?" Thomas didn't need to answer. He already had.